My name is Rocco Galati. I'm the Executive Director of the Constitutional Rights Centre in Toronto. I've been asked to give a very brief overview of the issue of potential mandatory vaccinations in the employment context in Canada. In very broad strokes, our legal order has been described by the Supreme Court of Canada as a normative legal order. That is, all relationships in Canada are governed by the rule of law and law. In very broad strokes, there's only two types of law in our system. There's public law, which includes such law as criminal law, regulatory law, administrative law, and other public law, which governs the relationship between the state, the governments, and the citizen. On the other side, there's what we call private law. And the private law governs the relationship as between private citizens. And there's only two broad types of law in private law. You have contract as between individuals and tort. So contract governs your obligations and promises when two minds meet, when you both come to an agreement. Tort governs the consequences of your conduct when you do something that harms someone else. In that context, and in the context of mandatory vaccinations, in Canada, any treatment, medical treatment, including vaccination, without the informed consent of the citizen is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court of Canada has already ruled this. And so, with respect to government action, if any government body tried to impose mandatory vaccinations, it's unconstitutional. So if you, in the employment context, if you work for a level of government, any form of government, and they try to impose mandatory vaccinations, that would be unconstitutional. Whether it's imposed through collective bargaining or whether it's imposed for the first time during the course of a contract. In the private context, it's a bit more nuanced and complicated, but at the end of the day, the Constitutional Rights Centre arrives at the same conclusion. In a private context, if you sign a contract agreeing to be vaccinated as part of your employment, then the employer does have a basis to say, well, if you don't, once you've signed that contract, if you don't adhere to being vaccinated, that they can dismiss you. If your contract is already underway and you're employed and they try to parachute that provision of now having for the first time after you sign the contract without a vaccination proviso, try to impose that, well, they can't do that. And if they fired you for it, that would constitute wrongful dismissal and you could sue your employer for that. We at the Constitutional Rights Centre are of the legal opinion that trying to impose mandatory vaccination in even the private employment contract is not allowed. Strictly speaking, the Charter only applies to government action. So if you're a government employee, you can invoke the Charter. It does not apply to private relationships of contract and tort, except that the Supreme Court of Canada has held that even where the Charter does not strictly apply, Charter values apply. And the Supreme Court of Canada has also held that the common law that's enforced by the judges of our country is also subject to constitutional and Charter scrutiny. So, taken in the context of the law of contract, it's the view of the Constitutional Rights Centre that to violate on a private basis what, if had been violated by public authorities, would constitute a constitutional violation, then that part of the contract, in our view, is not enforceable because it's unconscionable at common law. There's a doctrine of conscionability even in a contract, that if a proviso shocks the conscience for some reason, pursuant to public policy, it's not enforceable. It's our view that to do something that would otherwise violate your constitutional rights, if the state had done it, would be an unconscionable provision in the contract. Furthermore, any court that would enforce a provision that otherwise would constitute a constitutional violation of medical treatment without informed consent, that court judgment or the common law of contract in enforcing such a provision would also violate the Charter. At the end of the day, it's the view of the Constitutional Rights Center that any way you cut it, mandatory vaccination in all employment contexts would be unconstitutional and or illegal and unenforceable. Of course, if you get fired in the private context, then your only remedy is to sue for wrongful dismissal. What would happen if you took the vaccine, you agreed to the vaccine, and you got injured? Could you sue your employer? And the likely answer is you could, but you may not succeed because at the end of the day, you've agreed. What you can do is get your employer to acknowledge that you're taking it even though you do not wish to take it, and if there's any side effects or damage to you, that the employer acknowledges that they will be strictly liable to compensate you for any such physical or neurological damage from the vaccine. There are those who say, no way, I don't want this vaccine, I'm not going to take it, period. So that is not a choice. I've never would advise somebody to do something they don't want. But if they're concerned, they would do it, but they're concerned in the event of an eventuality, then they can mitigate that eventuality. But it still has to be basically consensual with the proviso. Well, if mandatory vaccines are imposed on all Canadians, both children and adults, we can go and get an injunction under the July 6th, 2020 challenge that we filed with respect to the COVID measures. If they're only imposed with respect to children, then we can bring an injunction on both the 2020 July 6th challenge, but as well we can bring an injunction with respect to the 2019 challenge that strictly deals with children in the school system.